All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at introspection.
Yeah, introspection.
And, I think for you, the philosopher, this is going to be particularly interesting
Oh, absolutely.
because it really gets at the heart of how we know our own minds, especially our current mental states or processes or even
Yeah.
stuff that's just happened.
Yeah, like what's going on right now, or even just a moment ago. That's the real meat of it, I think.
Right. And to really dig into this, we've got a rich source to guide us, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
A classic. It's always a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the first question that pops up is, what exactly is introspection? It seems pretty obvious at first glance, thinking about your own thoughts.
Yeah, that's the kind of intuitive understanding most people have.
But as the encyclopedia points out, there's no single definition everyone agrees on.
Right, there's a lot of nuance there. Philosophers have been wrestling with this for centuries.
We've got psychology, we've got behavioral observation, even neuroscience,
Yeah.
all offering insights into the mind.
But introspection is often seen as something distinct, a fundamental way of being aware of ourselves.
Almost like a first-person access,
Hmm.
a direct line to your own mental world.
Exactly. And to try to pin down what exactly makes something introspection, philosophers have proposed different necessary conditions. One of the first is the mentality condition.
Mentality condition.
Yeah. What this basically means is that introspection is all about mental events, states, or processes. It's not about the outside world directly.
Okay, so seeing a red apple, that's not introspection.
Right. But thinking about seeing red, the experience itself, that's where introspection comes in.
I see. So it's about the mental aspect of the experience, not the external stimulus.
Exactly. The Stanford Encyclopedia also gives examples of bodily self-knowledge, like knowing your arms are crossed or feeling pain.
Right. But the key here is the difference between, say, the fact that your arms are crossed and the feeling of them being crossed.
It's the mental judgment that matters, the awareness of the state, not just the state itself.
So introspection, according to this condition, is about the feeling of crossed arms, the sensation of pain.
Precisely. The next important condition is the first-person condition.
First person. So like from my own perspective.
Exactly. Introspection is about your own mind, not someone else's. You can't directly introspect another person's thoughts or feelings.
Right. I can try to guess what you're thinking, but that's not the same as directly experiencing your thoughts.
Not at all. That's more about theory of mind, not introspection.
And the encyclopedia even mentions those wild thought experiments, like telepathy or those brain-to-brain interfaces where minds might be linked.
Ah, yes. Those are always fun to think about.
But even in those scenarios, it seems like the general idea is that introspection remains a solitary thing.
Yeah, you're exploring your own mental realm. Even if it's influenced by another mind, the introspection part is still about your experience.
Okay. And then there's the temporal proximity condition.
Temporal proximity. So this is about the timing of things.
Introspection, it seems, is really about your current mental life.
Or stuff that's just happened in the very recent past.
Right. So I can't introspect a thought I had a year ago.
Not directly, no. But you can introspect your current memory of that thought.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's about what's happening now or what just happened.
And the encyclopedia points out that exactly how recent the past has to be might depend on how you see introspection working.
So are we detecting a mental state that's already there or shaping it as we introspect?
Right. Different models have different implications for how tightly the timing is linked to the present moment.
So those are some of the key conditions that are pretty much agreed upon. But there are other conditions that philosophers debate, right?
Oh, yeah, plenty of those. One of the big ones is the directness condition.
Directness, so how immediate the access is.
Right. The idea is that introspection is supposed to give you knowledge pretty directly without a lot of inference.
Okay, so if I see a car and then figure out that I must be having a visual experience, that's not really introspection.
Yeah. Not according to this condition. It's supposed to be more like immediate access to the experience itself.
But I think the encyclopedia mentions transparency theories, which we'll get to later, and they challenge this whole idea of directness, don't they?
Absolutely. They offer a very different perspective on how we gain self-knowledge.
Okay, so directness is up for debate. What about the detection condition?
Ah, yes, the detection condition. This one says that introspection involves detecting a mental state that's already there.
So the mental state exists whether or not I introspect it.
Right. It's what philosophers call ontologically independent. The introspective judgment is caused by the mental state, but it's not the same thing as the state itself.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like I have this thought, and then I detect it through introspection.
Precisely. But there are some tricky cases, like if I silently think to myself, I am now thinking.
It's like, am I detecting a thought? Or is the act of thinking that thought creating it?
Right, it gets a bit meta. And as the encyclopedia points out, there are accounts like self-shaping, expressivism, and transparency, all of which question this whole model of introspection as detecting a pre-existing thing.
They offer alternative ways to think about how introspection might work.
Exactly. And then there's the effort condition.
Effort condition. So is introspection something we do all the time, or does it require effort?
Well, this condition says it's not constant and effortless. You have to actually reflect, focus your attention inward.
Right. It's not like my mind is constantly introspecting everything that's happening.
Exactly. It's more like you have to consciously choose to introspect.
But of course, some philosophers argue against this, saying that consciousness itself involves a kind of self-monitoring.
Right, so maybe there's a basic level of introspection always going on, even if we don't explicitly focus on it.
So even these basic conditions show just how complex the concept of introspection is. There's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. And that's just the starting point. It gets even more interesting when you consider what we can actually introspect. What are the targets, as it were, of this inner observation?
Good question. What can we introspect? It seems like it can't be everything mental.
Right. The Stanford Encyclopedia makes it clear that some mental processes are just not accessible to introspection.
Like the early stages of visual processing, right? How light signals are converted into neural signals.
Exactly. Or all the complex computations involved in understanding language. Those happen below the level of conscious awareness.
And then there are those unconscious beliefs and desires like Freud talked about.
Yeah, those are generally considered off limits to direct introspection. You can't just peek into your unconscious.
Right, that's where psychoanalysis comes in, with all its indirect methods of interpretation.
Exactly. And when it comes to character traits, philosophers are cautious about saying we can introspect those directly.
We might think we can, I'm a kind person, or I'm easily stressed.
But those judgments are probably based more on observing our own behavior and comparing ourselves to others.
Right, it's more like external observation turned inwards, not the same as directly experiencing a mental state.
Exactly. So what are the main targets then? What kinds of mental phenomena are generally accepted as introspectable?
Well, the encyclopedia focuses on two main categories: attitudes and conscious experiences.
Attitudes and conscious experiences. Okay, let's break those down.
Attitudes are things like our beliefs, our desires, our evaluations, our intentions, basically our stances towards things.
And conscious experiences.
Those are our sensory perceptions, like seeing colors, hearing sounds, feeling textures, and also the qualitative aspects of emotions and mental imagery.
So what it feels like to be angry or to imagine a beach.
Exactly, the what its likeness of experience.
And of course, there can be overlap between these categories, can't there?
Right, a philosopher might argue that some conscious experiences inherently involve attitudes. Like experiencing the redness of an apple might also involve believing that it's red.
Or that our attitudes can be the content of our conscious experience, like being consciously aware of your desire for a cup of coffee.
Exactly. And even within these categories, not everything might be equally introspectable. Some accounts might focus on one target over the other.
So we've got a better grasp of what introspection might be and what we think we can introspect. But what about the products? What do we actually get from introspection?
What do we get? Well, most philosophers agree that introspection gives us judgments or beliefs about our own minds.
So not just the raw feeling itself, but our cognitive grasp of that feeling.
Right. It's like, I'm not just feeling sad, I'm also forming the belief I am sad.
Exactly. But some philosophers use different terms like thoughts, representations, awareness, or even acquaintance.
It's all about how we conceptualize this inner knowledge.
Right. And this leads us to the question of how introspection compares to other ways of knowing ourselves. What about non-introspective self-knowledge?
That's a crucial distinction. How do we gain self-knowledge if we're not looking inward?
Well, one prominent view is the idea of self-other parity, also known as theory theory.
Parity. So knowing ourselves the same way we know others.
Exactly. The idea is that we understand our own minds much like we understand other people's minds, by observing behavior and applying our general knowledge of psychology.
So just like I might infer that you like coffee because I see you drinking it every day.
I might infer that I like coffee based on my own coffee drinking behavior.
Makes sense. But this seems to challenge the whole idea of introspection as a unique first-person access.
It does, and a lot of research supports this parity view, like the work of Nisbet and Wilson.
Ah, yes. Nisbet and Wilson, they did those famous studies showing that we're often unaware of the real reasons for our choices.
Right, like their study with stockings, people overwhelmingly chose the rightmost pair of identical stockings.
And then they came up with all these elaborate justifications for their choice, denying that the position had any influence.
Exactly. It suggests that we don't always have this direct insight into our own motivations. We often just rationalize after the fact.
And Gopnik's work in developmental psychology also supports this idea of parity.
Right. Her research shows that kids develop the ability to attribute mental states to themselves, and around the same time, they develop that ability for others.
So if we have this special introspective access, you might expect that to develop earlier for our own minds.
But it seems to happen in parallel, suggesting that our self-knowledge might be based on the same kind of theoretical reasoning we use to understand others.
So if a kid can't understand that someone else might have a false belief, they probably can't understand that they themselves might have a false belief either.
Exactly. But it's important to note that even proponents of self-other parity don't claim that it's a perfectly symmetrical thing.
Right? It's not like they're saying there's absolutely no difference between knowing yourself and knowing others.
Nisbet and Wilson, for example, admitted that we might have more certainty about some things, like current sensations or strong attitudes.
And Gopnik allows for a kind of vague, direct sense of internal activity, though she says it can be easily overridden by our theories.
Right, and Ryle talked about twinges and thrills that we have private access to. So there's an acknowledgement that there might be something unique about self-knowledge.
But no one seems to have a fully fleshed out account of pure parity. It might be more applicable to certain mental states than others.
Like maybe we rely more on external cues and general theories when judging our own personality traits or unconscious motives.
Right. Carruthers makes that argument that parity is mainly for things like beliefs and desires, not for things like inner speech or imagery, which we seem to have more direct access to.
Okay, so self-other parity offers one alternative to introspection. What are some other perspectives?
Well, another big one is the idea of self-detection.
Self-detection. So we're back to the idea of a kind of inner sense.
Exactly. This aligns with that intuitive notion of introspection as a way of detecting mental states that are already there, like Locke's concept of internal sense.
It's the looking inward model. But the encyclopedia points out a key difference from external perception.
Right? It doesn't seem like there are distinct introspective appearances, like sensory qualia.
Exactly. When I see red, there's a specific what it's like quality to that experience, but what does it feel like to believe that it's raining?
It's not so clear. There's no obvious sensory quality to that belief.
So that's a point of debate. But even without those distinct introspective feels, self-detection could still work.
If it satisfies those other conditions we talked about, mentality, first person, temporal proximity, directness, and of course detection.
Right. It has to be about detecting a pre-existing mental state. And Shoemaker emphasizes that independence. The mental state has to exist on its own, whether or not we introspect it.
But this inner sense analogy also has to explain why our self-knowledge seems so special. You know, that privileged access we talked about.
Right. Self-detection, being like perception, could still be fallible. But it feels like our knowledge of our own minds is more immediate and certain than our knowledge of the external world.
So how do self-detection accounts address that?
Well, there are different variations. Some propose simpler monitoring mechanisms, while others are more complex.
Okay, let's start with the simpler ones.
All right. Armstrong, for example, proposed a self-scanning process happening in the brain.
So our brains are constantly scanning for mental states.
That's his idea, but it's important to distinguish between the low-level awareness produced by the scanning and the actual mental state it's targeting.
So it's not like the scanning itself is conscious, it's more like a background process.
Right, and this scanning, according to Armstrong, is pretty much continuous and automatic.
Which I guess could go against that effort condition we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It would mean we're always introspecting, even if we're not aware of it.
Okay, what about other simple monitoring accounts?
Morales draws on signal detection theory, which is used to study perception.
So applying the principles of perception to introspection.
Exactly. His idea is that our conscious experiences have different levels of intensity or phenomenal magnitude.
So some experiences are louder, so to speak, than others.
Right. And when we introspect, we're essentially focusing our attention on those experiences.
And the more intense the experience, the more accurate our introspection.
That's the basic idea. Then there's the influential model proposed by Nichols and Stitch.
Nichols and Stitch, I remember them talking about belief boxes and desire boxes.
Ah, yes, that's a helpful way to visualize it. Their idea is that when we become aware of our beliefs and desires
It's like our mind has a little mechanism that grabs representation from these
and
boxes,
slaps a I believe or I desire tag on it.
creating a new belief about our own mental state.
Exactly. And they propose a similar mechanism for perceptual experiences as well.
So it's a pretty straightforward monitoring process.
Right. What's interesting is that they use evidence from people with autism and schizophrenia to support this model.
Because those conditions involve different impairments in social cognition.
Right. People with autism often have difficulties understanding other minds, but their self-monitoring seems intact.
And with schizophrenia, it can be the opposite. They might have good theory of mind, but their self-monitoring is impaired.
Exactly. This double dissociation suggests that these two abilities might rely on different brain systems.
Okay, so those are some simpler monitoring accounts. But some philosophers argue they're not complex enough,
Right. They say that these simple models can't account for everything about introspection.
like Goldman, for example.
Goldman argues that these models don't explain how we know the type of attitude we're introspecting.
So how do I know if I'm introspecting a belief or a desire?
Exactly. Or how intense the attitude is. Nichols and Stitch's model doesn't address that.
So what does Goldman propose instead?
He suggests that we actively categorize our mental states when we introspect.
So we first attend to the state, and then we sort it into a category: belief, desire, feeling, etc.
Right. And when it comes to the content of those attitudes, he says we redeploy that content.
Redeploy. What does that mean?
Basically, we take the content of the belief or desire and incorporate it into our introspective belief about that attitude.
So if I believe that it's raining, I redeploy that content and form the belief, I believe that it's raining.
Exactly. He also talks about the possibility of translation, where some mental states, like visual experiences, might need to be converted into a format that can be introspected.
Right, because visual experiences aren't propositional like
Yeah.
beliefs. They're more like raw sensory data.
Exactly. So Goldman's model adds more complexity to the process.
And Hill also offers a multi-process view, right?
Yeah.
But she focuses on attention.
Right. She emphasizes the role of attention in introspection, but she goes a step further and says that attention can actually transform the experience.
So it's not just passive observation.
Not necessarily. By attending to a feeling or thought, we might actually change it, amplify it, clarify it, maybe even create aspects of it.
So introspection could be a creative act, in a sense.
In a way, yes, which blurs the lines with those self-shaping accounts we'll discuss later.
And then there's Prince, who also argues for multiple mechanisms.
Right. He says the specific mechanism depends on what we're introspecting and how we're accessing it.
So am I focusing my attention or just passively noticing? Am I using language or something else?
Exactly. And he agrees with Hill that introspection can sometimes modify the target mental state.
Okay, so those are some more complex self-detection accounts. But the encyclopedia also mentions the intriguing idea of introspection without self-detection.
Introspection without self-detection. So, how could we know our own minds without actually detecting a mental state?
Well, there are several interesting scenarios. One involves self-fulfilling self-ascriptions.
Self-fulfilling, so the very act of making the judgment makes it true.
Exactly. Like if I say, I am thinking, or I am judging that I am making a judgment.
The very act of thinking those thoughts makes them true.
Right. There's no need to detect a pre-existing mental state because the self-ascription creates it.
I see. So it's a special case where self-reference guarantees truth.
Exactly. Then there are self-ascriptions that seem to come from our judgments about the world.
So not looking inward, but outward.
Right. Like if I figure out that Stanford is south of Berkeley, I can then say, I believe that Stanford is south of Berkeley.
Without actually introspecting a pre-existing belief about Stanford's location.
It's like a shortcut. I go from a belief about the world to a belief about my belief.
Interesting. This leads us to some more radical accounts, like Burgess' theory of self-fulfillment and containment.
Containment. So the thought and the thought about the thought are somehow one and the same.
Exactly. He argues that certain self-ascriptions actually contain the very mental state they're about.
So if I judge, I'm thinking of a banana, the very act of making that judgment involves thinking of a banana.
Right. It's not two separate things. The thought and the judgment about the thought are intertwined.
But what about conscious experiences? How can a judgment contain a raw feeling?
Well, that's where things get tricky. Shoemaker offers a neural perspective on containment.
So not containment of content, but containment at the level of brain activity.
Right. He distinguishes between the core neural activity that's sufficient for a mental state and the total realization, which includes all the downstream effects.
So maybe the neural basis of a thought overlaps with the neural basis of our awareness of that thought.
Exactly. And then there are models that focus specifically on the containment of conscious experience.
Like Husserl, Papineau, and Chalmers.
Right. They suggest that our self-awareness of experience might actually contain those experiences.
So when I introspect a feeling, I'm not just judging that I have it, I'm somehow incorporating the feeling itself into the judgment.
That's the idea. Papineau calls it a quotational account. Like, I'm having this experience where this refers directly to the experience itself.
But that raises the question of how a judgment, which is conceptual, can contain a raw experience, which isn't.
Right. That's a major challenge for these models. It's led to the idea of phenomenal concepts, special concepts that can somehow capture the essence of experience.
And the encyclopedia points out that these containment judgments are limited in time, right?
Yeah, if the judgment depends on containing the experience, what happens when the experience is gone?
Chalmers acknowledges that limitation. And Papineau suggests that we might recreate aspects of past experiences when we think about them.
Okay, so that's containment. What about other non-detection accounts?
Well, there's the idea of self-shaping.
Self-shaping. So instead of just detecting, we're actually creating or influencing our mental states.
In a way, yes. The idea is that our self-ascriptions can actually shape our attitudes and dispositions.
So if I keep telling myself I'm a brave person, I might actually become braver.
That's the thinking. McGeer and Zawitsky are big proponents of this view. They say that our self-ascriptions create commitments and expectations that guide our actions.
And Dennett has similar ideas. He suggests that our introspective reports about consciousness might be like stories we tell ourselves.
Or that formulating an attitude can sometimes bring it into existence.
Right. It's not about discovering something pre-existing, but about actively shaping our mental landscape.
And then there are commissive accounts.
Commissive, so like making a commitment.
Exactly. Moran and Kaliva argue that we often come to know our own minds through deliberation.
We weigh the evidence, consider the reasons, and then decide what to believe, desire, or intend.
And our self-ascriptions follow from that commitment.
So it's not about introspecting a belief that's already there. It's about making a decision and then forming the belief based on that decision.
Right. It's like, okay, I've considered all the arguments and I'm committing to believing X.
And then you can say, I believe X.
Okay, so that's commissive accounts. What about expressivism?
Ah, yes, expressivism. That's a fascinating one, famously associated with Wittgenstein.
The idea here is that certain utterances about our mental states are more like expressions than descriptions.
Like, I am in pain. It's not really a statement of fact, but an expression of the pain itself.
Like a groan or a wince.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein famously argued that you don't know you're in pain, you just are in pain.
But simple expressivism, where these utterances aren't even considered genuine ascriptions, runs into problems.
Right. It struggles to explain how those utterances can have meaning and structure.
So neo-expressivist theories try to address that. They say that expressive utterances can still have content.
But their epistemic basis is different from descriptive statements.
Right. So they're not based on detecting a mental state, but on expressing it.
Exactly. And there's debate about which mental states can be understood in this expressivist way.
Okay, so that's expressivism. And finally, we come to transparency theories.
Transparency. So we're seeing through something.
In a way, yes. But what we're seeing through is our own mental states to the world they're about.
So we're not looking inward, but outward.
Exactly. Evans is a key figure in this view. When it comes to beliefs, he says we simply consider the world to know what we believe.
So to know if I believe it's raining, I just look outside.
Exactly. And Harman uses the example of seeing a tree.
Right. We see the colors and shapes as features of the tree itself, not our visual experience.
It's hard to even focus on the redness of our seeing red.
Yeah.
We just see the red tree.
Interesting. So our attention is directed outwards, not inwards.
And Gordon argues that this transparency idea applies to all our attitudes. We figure out what we want by considering what's desirable in the world.
Right. So it's not about introspecting a pre-existing desire, but about reflecting on what's worth desiring.
And this aligns with those commissive accounts, where our self-ascriptions are based on our commitments and deliberations.
So there's a connection between these different non-detection accounts.
Definitely. And what's interesting about transparency is that it connects to some derivational models of self-knowledge.
Derivational. So we're deriving our self-knowledge from something else.
Right. Byrne, Dresk, and Roche all suggest that we essentially infer, I believe, P from our acceptance of P itself.
So it's like a logical step. If I believe it's raining, then I must believe that I believe it's raining.
Exactly. Dretske even compares it to displaced perception, like knowing the mail has arrived because you hear the dog bark.
You're inferring one thing from another without directly perceiving it.
And Tai applied this displaced perception model to conscious experience, though he later revised his view.
But transparency for sensory experience faces some challenges, doesn't it?
Right. Some philosophers argue that we can attend to qualities of our experience itself.
Like the blurriness of our vision or those after images you get from staring at a bright light.
Exactly. Seert says that reflecting on sensory experience doesn't require completely withdrawing attention from the object.
So maybe transparency isn't a perfect analogy for conscious experience.
It might be more complex than that.
Okay, so we've got all these different accounts. Self-other parity, self-detection, self-fulfillment, self-shaping, expressivism, transparency.
It's a lot to take in. And it shows that there's no single agreed-upon story of how we know our own minds.
Which leads to the idea of introspective pluralism.
Pluralism. So there are multiple ways to introspect.
Well, Schitzkel goes even further. He argues that there's no single thing called introspection.
It's not a unified faculty or process.
Right. He says we use a bunch of different cognitive processes when we think about our own minds.
Whatever's handy at the moment.
Exactly. Like he compares it to looking at a poster at a conference.
You use whatever cognitive tools are available to take in the information.
Right. So there's no special dedicated introspection module in the brain.
But other philosophers, while acknowledging the diversity, still think there might be some dedicated introspective processes.
So it's a matter of degree. How much pluralism is there in introspection?
Right. And it's worth noting that introspection has also played a significant role in psychology, not just philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a key tool in the study of the mind.
The encyclopedia reminds us that philosophers have been making introspective claims for centuries.
From Aristotle talking about mental imagery to Berkeley and his ideas about abstract ideas.
But it wasn't until the 19th century that psychology really started using quantitative introspective methods.
Quantitative. So they were trying to measure and quantify mental phenomena.
Exactly. Pioneers like Helmholtz, Fechner, and Wundt. They wanted to get precise data about sensory experience.
So things like the just noticeable difference between stimuli or the absolute threshold of perception.
Right. And the Weber-Fechner law, which describes the relationship between stimulus intensity and perceived sensation.
They also tried to map the dimensions of sensory experiences, like the color solid.
And introspection was a key tool for all of this. William James even said that introspection is the primary method for studying the mind.
But I think a lot of these early psychologists were skeptical of untrained introspection.
Right, they thought everyday introspection was too prone to bias and error.
Wundt only trusted the reports of people who had done thousands of practice trials.
Wow, that's a lot of introspection.
And Titchener even wrote a whole manual for training people in introspection.
So they took it very seriously as a scientific method.
But they also recognized its limitations.
And from the beginning, there were criticisms of introspection's scientific validity.
Like the worry that introspecting a mental state might actually change it.
Right. Comte argued that you can't be both the observer and the observed.
Which is a classic philosophical problem.
And these criticisms led to various responses. James advocated for immediate retrospection.
So, reflecting on the experience right after it happens to minimize interference.
Exactly. Brentano distinguished between inner observation and inner perception.
Where inner perception is more passive, a kind of background awareness.
Right. And Wundt, while acknowledging the potential for interference, was optimistic about introspecting certain simpler processes.
Like basic perception. He thought that attending to the experience of seeing red wouldn't really change the experience itself.
But despite these efforts, introspection faced a decline in the early 20th century.
Why was that?
Well, there were disagreements about fundamental issues, like whether imageless thought exists.
Yes, that was a big debate.
And there were.